Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 2nd of December. Today's update is going to be brief because of my tight schedule, but we are going to really look at so many updates beginning east of Velyka Novosilka, also Kurakhove, Toretsk, and north of Kupyansk. There are a lot of developments that need to be mentioned. Here, you could see that the Russians have consolidated control over 25 square kilometers of territory south of the urban cluster. It really is a significant amount, but it's not due to the Russians capturing it just in one fell swoop. There's much more to the story. It's a combination of several factors. First of all, the Russians putting enormous pressure due to their captures of Starmayorsk and Oruzhenia, and then the really important breakthrough that occurred last week in between the Shaitanka and Kashlach rivers, which you see over here with my cursor going over the respective rivers, which allowed the Russians to set up this outpost just east of Velyka Novosilka, again creating a flanking opportunity for any other Ukrainian squads that were operating southwards in these fields and in the very few dugouts that are located in this area, because it is so broad and because the Russian forces do have a large advantage here, both when it comes to the amount of forces being utilized, the momentum, and the firepower being utilized. It really created a difficult situation for the very small amount of Ukrainian defenders, which probably would be a part of the presidential brigade or one of its two battalions operating around here. So it didn't seem logical to continue holding on to such areas with a very heavy price and in very, very unfavorable circumstances. And so the Ukrainians withdrew to Bladatnya, or even west of the river towards Skuchnes, Torozheve, Makarivka, and then Velyka Novosilka itself. The issue is now you have very, very little depth between the line of contact and the river itself. It's only about 2 kilometers. So any remaining squads that are located east of the river are now under enormous pressure and have to find a way to either hold the line for and breathing space just to give them enough time to withdraw, or to do that immediately, because there is a threat of supplies being cut off for these four villages located south of Velyka Novosilka if the Russian forces are to continue with their advances just at the eastern approaches of the city, at which point, let's say they advance like, I don't know, 2 kilometers westwards, then the ability of resupply along this particular road, this paved road on the western riverbank of the Mokriali River, would be so difficult just due to the physical dynamics of moving heavy equipment across, or even just troops, due to direct fire. And so that's something that not only the Ukrainians in the urban cluster have to contend with, but everything else in this entire sector is in danger of suffering from those sort of supply bottlenecks. And you can see that now the Russian forces have not just created an outpost east of Velyka Novosilka, but they have an entire line, this very stable line, wherein you have three brigades mainly that are operating and continuing to consolidate and advance. And they're doing so now north of the city of Velyka Novosilka via Novi Komar. So you can see here, according to Deep State, at least 6 Russian vehicles attacked from their positions south of Rozdonia and advanced in total, if we're going to measure it right now, 5 kilometers westward. So it is a significant advance. It included 4 infantry fighting vehicles, 2 of which the Ukrainians claim were at the very least damaged, and then 1 tank and then 1 armored vehicle, which dismounted forces in Novi Komar. Deep State claims that there were still Russian soldiers here and that they're bombing the rest of the village that is not under their complete control right now. So it does appear to be at least partially in a gray zone. The issue here is not only has the road that we've talked about so much infamous by now between Andrivka and Velyka Novosilka been cut off, but also this smaller road that branches out from the Kamar route. Because Kamar, if you see here, there's a 00509 road. It runs west of Mokreli River. Then at this particular point, and you can see my cursor going over the river here, it crosses and then moves southwards into Velyka Novosilka. So it's another route that theoretically could have been used even if the route west of Rozdonia was cut off, but both of them were cut off in the same assault. And the way that the Russians will be able to base and ensure that the Ukrainians don't reconnect is by capturing a static defense area like Novi Komar, an actual village. And it's not just an issue of supply, but also of just literal physical flanking, because now you have the opportunity as a Russian garrison with, an astute amount of experience with armored columns and advancements in similar fashions, the ability to advance along the 509 road into the northern approaches of the city, in addition to the various other routes that the Russians have opened for themselves, that they've really paved over the past couple of weeks. So it is concerning for whatever Ukrainian squads, from the presidential brigade or otherwise, remain in this location. When it comes to elevation, the Russians are continuing to get control over key heights. Again, if you want to visualize how the heights look like, sort of something like this, not necessarily Rozdolia, but nearby fields are on key hills. And those hills, I'm going to mark the lower elevated regions in yellow. They overlook everything along the riverbank. And you can see that includes areas like Velyka Novosilka and really anything north or south of it. When it comes to the Ukrainian side and their sort of solace, it would be in the fact that just west of the river, you have these higher elevated regions, which are currently partially under their control because, of course, the Russians also have control of the extensions of those ridges located further south in areas like Rivnopil and Stromayorsk. But again, a complicated situation elevation wise when you're the Russians and inflicting direct fire onto smaller garrison of Ukrainian forces located within a floodplain, it really compounds already existing issues in so many other fields. So definitely something to keep it out for. That the Russians can now potentially expand here and create so much more additional pressure for the city of Velyka Novosilka. And that's why I think we should also be looking at how the Ukrainians withdraw effectively and then to where this ends, whether the Russians could then shift their focus to Novi Kumar or try to exploit this gap in the trenches between, northeast of Huliapoli to Shevchenko, because you have this sort of area here, this 13-kilometer area where there hasn't been sufficient amount of defenses built. There's a lot of possibilities, but it all begins with Velyka Novosilka, which is what the Russians are now shaping up to do. In any case, I want to look at Kurakhove right now. You can see that just to the south of the city, the Russians have captured nearly 5 square kilometers, so that is an important advance. When it comes to the horizontal gains, it's about 1.8 kilometers, and it's south of Pivdenia. Pivdenia is currently, you could say for the most part under Ukrainian control, and there are a few really important high-rise buildings here, which gives the Ukrainians the ability to at least stay on parity with the Russians elevation-wise, because again, the Russians capturing all these huge open fields and a lot of the trenches built that were supposed to be the perimeter of Kurakhove. Ironically, the Russians are taking them over and then advancing even deeper into the Ukrainian lines via the paved routes along the anti-tank ditches or trenches themselves. And so they're taking control over a lot of heights that go along with those trenches. So the Ukrainians really have this important forward base through which to overlook the Russian advances, spot them, and then prepare accordingly and fire in Pivdenia. But it is difficult for the Ukrainians because you have the Russian pincer from the south, which hasn't really put pressure yet on the district, but it could very well do so now that all these other trenches and fields have been consolidated. And then to the north, you have the very interesting spearhead, which the Russians have been able to maintain. That's very impressive given how thin it looks on paper, because it's really based around an advance of one street. And the Russians have held the corridor, and over the past week, basically a week now, have been able to expand it. And in doing so, really take up and clear huge parts of eastern Kurakhove, and as a result, Pivdenia is also being flanked from the north. When it comes to the parts of Kurakhove that the Russians are continuing to take over, that includes this region over here. These are just private residential areas with gardens. They're dividing the houses, and you could see the same thing. We talked about it in previous videos, taken over by the Russian side. It's not the densest part of Kurakhove, but it is important for the Russians to at least have this as a basis to build off of. And they're doing so at a relatively quick pace, meaning that the casualties aren't that high because the fighting is not dragging out. It's just that the Russians were able to establish this base here, and then it created issues for whatever Ukrainian squads were on the flanks, leading to certain withdrawals that the Ukrainians hoped would not have occurred. And then the Russians could, fill in the vacuum, fill in the void. And a lot of it is also based around the high school number 5 over here. When it comes to the key Ukrainian locations, we've talked about this before, but just as a reminder, you have this massive apartment complex region, which the Russians have only partially infiltrated. Vast majority of it is still under Ukrainian control. So the 46th Air Assault Brigade, their task is going to be to drag out the fighting here for as long as possible, while Ukrainian forces on the rear, if you could call it that, a bit further to the west, they're building up defenses within the power plant, dam facilities, fishing facilities, mechanical plants, all of that in western part of Kurakhove. And that's going to be the idea of the Ukrainians to drag out the fighting, even if all the residential areas end up falling to the Russian side. Now, the plans here could definitely be hindered given the Russian advance is located a bit to the north. So here you can see Russian gains amounting to 4.8 square kilometers, and this confirms that even the outskirts of Beretsky are fully under Russian control, and that now they're beginning to push westwards, especially along this particular road. You can see it over here. It's very close to the Kurakhove Reservoir, and it leads into Stary Terny. So we have this video. I'm going to click on the link over here and it's from the Yokai Marine Group. So I believe this is from the 35th Marine Brigade, because the infamous unit that is involved with defensive operations over here for the Ukrainian side is the 35th Marine Brigade. 37th, as you guys know, is operating a bit to the south near Uspanivka, Trudove, and is in really, really a crucial part of those defensive activities. And then 38th Brigade is operating near Pokrovsk, and I believe that 36th is in Kursk. So those are where the four Marine brigades are. And they also have the Birds of Magyar unit that we're going to look at in a second. But there's also this Yukai Marine Group, and they just conducted various strikes onto trenches and houses west of Bretsky as they spotted the Russian attacks unfolding. And it could be that the Russian 114th Motor Rifle Brigade is involved in this. They have just enormous experience when it comes to sending in infantry-based assaults, not even mechanized, but just infantry on the ground, overrunning trenches in very small villages. They've really made a name for themselves over the past half year doing so. So they could be involved in this operation. And some FPVs targeted, like command bunkers within the trenches or houses themselves, really along this, I want to even call it floodplain, but this forested region leading up to Starry Tyranny. Russian sources claim that it is under their control already, and that would entail also capturing this really monumental trench facility to the north. This area that definitely the Ukrainians hoped could have prevented a northern flanking of Starry Tyranny. But if this is the case already, and I'm already marking it as a gray zone, and the Russians have the ability now to get control over a massive road junction. This road junction, it leads southwards, and then it could potentially cut off the industrial district of Kurakhove. And as a result, also give the Russians entry points towards Andrivka. And that would be the really, really worst case scenario, because, of course, Kurakhove, the Ukrainians understand that they're going to lose it at some point, but they're trying to drag out the fighting in the short to midterm. But when it comes to Andrivka, they would really hope to, have some sort of breathing space and really build it up, not just to the north where it is definitely built up, but also to the east and south. And if the eastern positions are already going to be compromised and the Russians are going to have access to the roads directly, then it's going to put a huge wrench in those plans. Because right now the focus is sort of still on dragging out fighting in Kurakhove, and not as much resources have been allocated towards Andrivka fully. And really, a lot of this would be compounded by the capture of Sontsivka, because as long as Sontsivka is not captured, you could still have this potential Ukrainian presence. This presence that is not massive, but it is enough to create sort of an issue for the Russians. It's an area that I'm circling in red that is completely open, not many static defenses here, no settlements, but it is just a landmass that separates Starry Tyranny from Sontsivka, and it's an area where you have the 35th Marine Brigade and several other territorial defense units or mechanized elements operating within. And it's also the means by which the Ukrainians are able to move from populated areas like Andrivka to the battle in Sontsivka, because Sontsivka continues to be engulfed in heavy fighting. But Russian sources have reported over the past 24 hours advances, in particular in the eastern section, whereas the western area still includes a Ukrainian presence. So Birds of Magyar, they're now renamed the 414th Strike Drone Regiment of the Marine Corps. They hit Russian sappers that were laying mines along this road in Sontsivka, once again proving that there are actually Russians operating here. And the Birds of Magyar unit also posted a 12-minute compilation of just other FPV strikes onto Russian forces in this area. So yeah, their presence is definitely marked, and the capture of Sontsivka would be important. Really, not just for the eastern approach to Andrivka, but also potentially getting control over all the villages, protecting the northern flank of Andrivka. But we'll have to look at that in more detail in another video. When it comes to the, I guess, south of Pokrovsk front, I don't necessarily know what to call this. To call this maybe Novoolonivka front, but let's say zooming in over here towards the highway, you have Russian advances south of Pushkine. They have not taken over the entire hamlet as far as I'm concerned, but it's definitely possible. The settlement is so small in surface area that if there's some sort of serious Russian assault and they're able to enter into a quarter of it, then it just follows that the Ukrainians are no longer operating there, or that their time there is definitely limited. So I believe that Pushkina will also fall. very soon. At the same time, west of Zoltve, the Russians are not letting off the gas, are continuing to advance, and this is with the intention of reaching first Novopustinka, but then also Novotroitska. That's the main goal, to cut off the highway between Andrivka and Pokrovsk, as we've been saying for so long, sever the connection between the two most important cities in this entire part of southern Donetsk / central Donetsk front line. And then the next sort of connector between those two cities is about 14, 15 kilometers away. So it really would increase the amount of time and effort needed to move across those two areas. Definitely an important goal for the Russians. Also, in order to then have a solid base of operations to attack northwards towards Pokrovsk, that's also a part of this. So here you have the 150th Reconnaissance Strike Battalion. They released this footage of grenade drops onto Russian soldiers north of Zoltve. So they're definitely, spotting those groups of soldiers on foot that are advancing along the rail line and advancing along windbreaks and dugouts and striking them accordingly. But it's also giving us confirmation that there is a Russian attempt to advance along the rail line here, as they've done in so many other cases, probably to reach Shevchenko, which would be the largest village they captured ever since Saidova, I believe. Also, looking here south of the Chenske, you have the Russians advancing nearly 3 square kilometers. Here you have this is film of the 68th Jaeger Brigade, Ukrainian units, showing how they conducted FPV strikes, artillery onto armored columns. I think it was at least 4 vehicles involved in this particular column, advancing westwards and then dropping off troops along this particular tree line, which directly feeds into the Chenske. So that's important because you have this huge chunk of territory that's in between the rail line where you have populated areas and then the next line of villages, which is under Ukrainian control and is a part of the third to last line of defense before Pokrovsk. Everything in between is largely in higher elevated area besides the villages themselves. So now the Russians are trying to consolidate control over whatever dugouts are in those hinterlands and the hills themselves in order to give them fire control over the set of villages. So now zoom in on Toretsk. This is very interesting footage coming out from the Predator Police Brigade, one of the main Ukrainian units that has been active online releasing footage. So we have here this from December 2nd. They claim to have killed 2 Russian soldiers and wounded 13 with their grenade drops, and they show the footage to back it up. Some of the footage is from the Zabalka district, and you could see sort of like the apartment buildings, which are probably part of southern Zabalka or duplexes. So those areas we already know were under Russian control. But what's interesting is how they were geolocated some of the videos to be in between, sandwiched in between 2 massive Terrikons, the massive waste heaps. Actually, you could say these three. And so there's a junction here with the paved road where Russian soldiers were able to arrive, but they were picked off in this particular video by grenades that were dropped from drones. But then we had another video, so it's not just a one-off of like, say, one sapper group or one DRG element, assault element that was able to infiltrate the Zabalka line and make their presence known in a certain area. There's actually another one even deeper, reaching the northernmost waste heap in this area. I believe it's called the waste heap number 2. That's what it's referred to by the local sources over here. So 21st Battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade, they also dropped grenades onto Russian infantry, both within Zabalka, but also some of the clips showed them on the slope of this waste heap. So that's really important. The thing is, the Ukrainians don't have like solid positions on the waste heaps because it's too close to the battlefield. The Russians do have, aviation, whether it's drones or air sorties, which would be very, very easy to mark out any position built up upon these slag heaps. It would just be way too exposed. So they're mainly operating northwards in the industrial area or in houses and basements. But whenever it's needed for some sort of transient period of time, there is the ability for the Ukrainians, at least up until now, to go up the slope and then fire or, sort of look and see what's going on with the Russians advancing through Zabalka and in the center of Toretsk. And now they've lost that ability. And the Russians actually have that ability to a certain extent. And they may feel more comfortable doing so than the Ukrainians if they're able to, ensure some sort of level of protection against sort of Ukrainian attacks. But I suppose it would be difficult because the Ukrainian drone crews will try to make it as difficult as possible for the Russians to maximize the advantage of having Terrikons under their control. At the very least, the Russians could sort of neuter it for the Ukrainian side, as they're doing right now. And besides the fact that they're getting control over those really important heights that are just completely dominating the elevation in this entire region. The Russians have also advanced 2.2 kilometers westward in a urban battle. So that's very impressive. They're advancing through an entire urban district, through houses, through this rail line over here. That's the route that they probably utilized. I don't think that's a rail line. I think it's just like a local tree line that runs along the road at some point and then sort of feeds into the Terrikon. And it also opens up other opportunities. It opens up the opportunity to completely take over the Zabalka district, and also gives the Russians this sort of southern flank to attack the industrial area of Toretsk, which the Russians were unable to enter from the street over here, Zerjinsky Street. Sorry, and also some of the houses over here, some of the houses which would be in southwestern Toretsk. So this really presents a new opportunity for the Russians, as they've already been able to create a solid base of control within the center, but not necessarily expand directly into the industrial region. They have been able to push northwestwards into some of the less dense regions where you have private residential areas. So that's important. And at the same time, they're now creating new opportunities, although they have to definitely consolidate it. And we have to see more proof of their presence here besides just small groups. And then they have the option to attack northwards. So really something to look at. And it could be an important development, which will allow the Russians to make substantial progress in the future within this urban battle. Now, to look at the Kupyansk front first, a bit to the south of it, we have this Russian advance amounting to 8.7 square kilometers. Really important gain. Again, the culmination of months upon months of pressure from Pischane, starting with the Pischane flower that has continued to bloom westwards towards the Oska River. Taking over this village has been so critical in the way that the battle has played out more generally east of the Oska River over here. You had Ukrainian holdouts that were sort of located southwest of Berestove, holding out in ditches, in tree lines, gullies, ravines, dugouts, whatever it may be. And at a certain point, it just became untenable for them because you have the Russians putting so much pressure from the Pishana region, and then at the same time continuing to advance west of Samakivka. Samakivka was captured, and now the Russians are shaping up to capture Lozova. And the first step is to just clear out remaining Ukrainians pockets of resistance to the north. So that's what they've done over here, sort of strengthening the front line. And now they have this sort of northern flank, which is to push and attack Lozova. Lozova is an exposed area. It's located just in between several ponds and gullies. It's on low elevation. It's completely overlooked by the fields west of Samakivka, and also to a certain extent the fields that are north of Lozove. So these regions will be critical for the Russians in their efforts to squeeze out the Ukrainians from this region. The fall of Lozova would be important because it would give the Russians direct access to one of the main defense lines that is built to prevent the Russians from reaching the Oskil River. So it would give them access to this line over here. And also it would give them, control over a village that is, let's see, the only one within the span of 5.6 kilometers before reaching this cluster of 3 villages that is actually located with their backs right against the Oskar River. So this is a way to just, take out one of the moving pieces, one of the most important locations, protecting the front line that ensures that the Ukrainians still have the connectivity near the Oskar River bank. And really, it would play a big role in the fate of these 3 villages, in addition to potential advances that could come from the north, from Kuklyakivka, where the Russians are already present. So something to keep in mind for the future. When it comes to the area north of Chasiv Yar, this is our Kupyansk. This is really interesting. You have continued Russian advances actually across the Oskil River. Small-scale DRG crossings are occurring, and this is due to the Ukrainians being unable to man the entirety of the river because the reinforcements are focused on, first of all, fighting near the Pischane sort of Russian sailing that has continued to expand, and then also around Kupyansk with the recent Russian breakthrough that occurred into Kupyansk itself. By now, the situation has stabilized, and actually, I have to change my front line to indicate that the Ukrainians have more control than I have depicted over here, because the Ukrainians are likely in control of the entirety of Kupyansk, with the Russians sort of on the outskirts near the rail line, in the forested regions, in the armory. But that has come at a cost of diverting forces and resources towards these regions, as opposed to the entire width of the river to the north. So the Russians took advantage of that, and they're now sort of shaping the battlefield in a way where they could take over Dvorichna, which is the most important village besides Kupyansk, running along the western bank of the Oska River. So first they got control over the heights south of Novomlinitsk, and they've not taken over the village in its entirety yet. There were reports from the Ukrainian side of a Russian assault towards Fiholivka, but it did not end up gaining anything. The Russians failed to advance there. But where they did succeed was west of Masyovivka. 3 kilometers, 3 square kilometers of territory taken, and they're very close to the P79 road, which connects Vyrochina directly to Kupyansk. I believe that in addition to the Vyrochina being a target, because it is just an important node, and you could see how the northern and southern flanks could, come together and amalgamate. There's also the opportunity here to advance from the north and create a solid base of operations to flank Kupyansk, to flank its western side from the north, and that would be a new option as opposed to just brute forcing a way into Kupyansk from the northern entrance, an area where the Ukrainians have already prepared extensively for assaults, because it's just understandable. The Russians are on the eastern side of the river, so of course more of the focus will be on that side. If the Russians could cross over, take over key hills, and then begin assaults from the west, that would be a way to sort of shake things up and divert Ukrainian soldiers, partially keep them disconnected from one another. And yeah, we're gonna have to see how that develops. I believe a litmus test for it that will be once the Russians reach, larger villages like Dvorichna or Zapadnya. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.